It's the 17th of April 1976, and the Mellings, a family of 4 from Lancashire, are visiting the Cornish town of Mothman for their Easter holidays. And on this particular day, the family's 2 children, 9-year-old June and 12-year-old Vicky, ask for permission to go exploring the woods together. Mothman is a tiny rural village with a population of just over 1,000 people. It's the kind of quiet, peaceful place where nothing bad ever seems to happen, so their parents didn't have any qualms about letting their 2 young girls go off alone. It's not until that afternoon when they realise their mistake, when June and Vicky come running back to their parents, screaming in terror and incoherent with distress. A million terrifying possibilities flicker through the minds of their parents as they try to calm down their children and find out what happened. But never in a million years would they have expected the story the girls shared. While out exploring, the girls had come upon St. Mornan and St. Stephen's Church, which, despite the name, is actually only one church. It's the kind of beautiful old church that's not uncommon in small English villages. Built in the 13th century and heavily restored in the 19th century, it's a Grade 2 listed building and, like the surrounding village, is named after St. Mornan, a 6th century monk who landed there from France in the year 520. Needless to say, it's somewhere that is steeped in history, and so it's no wonder that holidaymakers to the area will pay it a visit, regardless of their own religion. And that's exactly what the girls did, stepping out from the cover of the forest into the surrounding graveyard where parishioners have been buried for centuries. It's easy to imagine the girls in the churchyard, weaving their way through the ancient gravestones. Maybe they were playing together, or maybe they were just curious, having a look around. Whatever they were doing, the girls suddenly heard a strange sound, a sort of hissing noise coming from above them. The girls looked up, and what they saw shook them to the core. Hovering above the church's tower was a creature that looked like some ungodly hybrid of an owl and a human. It was the size of a man, but instead of arms it had wings and long legs that ended in fearsome black talons. The creature's whole body was covered in dark grey feathers, and its face bore a pair of large glowing red eyes, pointed ears on the top of its head, and a gaping mouth. As soon as they'd processed what was in front of them, the girls took off, running as fast as they could and screaming in terror until they reached their parents. Some sources will tell you that the girls' father, Don Mellings, went straight to the local police station to report what had happened, and that it was while they were there that the girls were separated so that each could give an account of what they'd seen and do a drawing of it, and both gave eerily similar accounts. Not what you'd expect from 2 young girls who were mistaken or who'd made it up. Other sources say that, instead of the police, Don actually went to the site of a local fun fair. This sounds like a strange course of action, but he did have his reasons. He was obviously sceptical of what his daughters had reported, but their terror was undeniable. They'd clearly seen something, but Don suspected that it was some sort of prank, and he soon found himself a prime suspect in the form of Tony Shields, known to many as Doc. Doc Shields was, well, he was a little bit of everything. An artist, a stage magician, a writer, a theatre guy, and from time to time, a monster hunter. In 1976, the same year the Owlman was first sighted, Doc received media attention from across the country when he shared photos that he claimed were of Morgar, a legendary sea monster from Cornish folklore. He said that in order to raise Morgar from the sea, he partnered with a coven of witches. So, yeah, Doc had a bit of a reputation, and given the sea monster thing, it's not surprising that he'd be a prime suspect for a potential fake Birdman. But when Don confronted him, Doc denied any knowledge of what happened. Doc and Don, this is going to get confusing. Don't worry, Don disappears from this story soon. Although Doc was insistent that he had nothing to do with whatever it was the girls had seen at the church, he was definitely interested in it and wanted to interview them, but Don refused. His girls had been through enough. He wasn't going to traumatise them further just to satisfy the curiosity of some local monster enthusiast. But he did provide Doc with a drawing done by June of what they'd seen. Regardless of what exactly went down in the aftermath, the girls were so shaken up by the incident in the churchyard that their family ended up cutting their holiday short, making the almost 7-hour-long car journey back home 3 days earlier than originally planned. According to CornishBirdblog.com, there was a second sighting of the Owlman only 2 days after the Mellings girls' encounter. Witnesses reported seeing a silver-grey bird so large they assumed it had to be some kind of prank, maybe even a person in a costume. But then it took off, disappearing into the sky and proving that whatever this was, it was clearly some kind of giant bird or bird-like creature and not just someone dressed up. As it flew away, it seemed to produce a strange sound, kind of like static, that lingered in the woods long after the bird had disappeared from view. This particular sighting wasn't mentioned in any of my other sources, but I will say that this particular article was much better researched than the vast majority of other coverage out there about the Owlman. So take it with a pinch of salt, I guess. 3 months later there came a third reported sighting, or the second if you want to discount the previous one. It was the 3rd of July when 14-year-old best friends Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry decided to go camping alone in the woods near St. Mornan and St. Stephen's Church. Which very much sounds like the start of a horror movie, but again, this was a place that was broadly considered to be safe. The kind of place where 2 girls could be out alone all night without having to worry about anything bad happening to them, so their parents gave them permission to go. From what I can tell, the previous sightings of the Owlman were not yet public knowledge, so certainly these 2 girls wouldn't have expected to encounter him. Had they known about the encounters in that area, they probably would have chosen to set up camp somewhere else. Or maybe they wouldn't. They were teenagers after all, and terrifying yourself and your friends by going to local haunted places at night is kind of a rite of passage. But at least when you go to the site of an urban legend or get out a Ouija board the way most teens do, you're doing so expecting something spooky to happen. That wasn't the case with Barbara and Sally. They thought their little camping trip would just be a bit of fun together. They certainly didn't expect to have the most terrifying experience of their lives. And as darkness fell on their first night out in the woods, the girls maintained that innocence as they began to prepare for bed. And then, while she was outside of the tent, Sally heard something. A strange hissing sound, much like the one Vicky and June had reported hearing. Curious about the source of the noise, but not really thinking too much about it, Sally turned round and immediately found herself staring into a pair of glowing red eyes. Standing about 20 yards from their campsite, there was a figure. He was the size of a large man, but looked more like a bird, with pointed ears and sharp claws. Upon making eye contact with Sally, he stretched out his wings and hissed at her, while Sally continued to stand there, frozen and silent with fear. Barbara, who until now had been in the tent, stuck her head out to ask her friend what the strange sound was, but before she had a chance to say a single word, she too saw the creature, who quickly flew away, disappearing up into the trees and being engulfed by the darkness of the night. The girls were both shaken to the core by what they'd just seen. But as much as they may have wanted to run for the safety of their homes, they were too scared to head out into the dark forest that surrounded them. So instead, they huddled together in the relative safety of their tent, until at long last the sun finally began to rise and the woods grew light enough that the girls finally felt safe to make a bid for home. Some time later, while walking along a beach near the church, the girls encountered who else but Doc Shields, and they told him about their terrifying night in the woods. Armed now with at least 2 separate accounts, Doc approached paranormal magazine The Fortean Times with the stories, where they were published alongside June's drawing. From what I can tell, both of these stories were reported at the same time, and that was the first time the Owlman of Mornan reached public awareness, though I can't be 100% sure about that. Alas, I did not have time to go hunting down a 50-year-old magazine article for a podcast I make as a volunteer. Regardless though, the Owlman soon seemed to capture public attention, but there wouldn't be any particularly notable sightings for another 2 years, until 1978. In the June of that year, a woman claimed to have seen a creature that by now we're very familiar with. A large owl, but with a body more like a man's, covered in dark feathers and with a pair of glowing red eyes, and a set of sharp talons instead of feet. Again, this sighting was in the immediate vicinity of the church, and he flew away as soon as he was seen. She described what she saw as a devil. And then in August, only 2 months later, 3 French college students who were staying in Mornan on holiday reported seeing a very big furry bird, with a gaping mouth and red round eyes. These students, like everyone else who had reported seeing the Owlman so far, were all female, and most of them were relatively young, many just girls. Is that in some way relevant, or is it just some strange coincidence? Could it be that the Owlman was deliberately seeking out or showing himself to certain types of people? But why? Again, things went relatively quiet for a while. There would be the odd reported sighting here and there, but nothing that ever really garnered much attention. But even when encounters with the Owlman waned, interest in him did not. And so when, in 1989, a teenage boy went on holiday to the area with his family and girlfriend, he decided to see if he could seek out the now legendary Owlman himself. Or possibly he did. With these kinds of stories, it's really hard to find reliable sources. Most favour sensationalism and spookiness over accuracy, and so there's often conflicting information. It's possible that the teenage couple went out into the woods looking for the Owlman, but it's also possible that they were just going out for an evening stroll together. It's also possible that this took place in 1988 and not 89. He apparently didn't share this story with anyone until 6 years after the event, so specifics are a little hard to nail down, including the exact location of where this happened, but it was in the woods in the general area of Mournen, possibly near the church, which seems to be the epicentre of the Owlman mythos for whatever reason. Regardless, while they were out on this walk, the two came across a strange creature perched up in a large tree, about 15 feet above their heads. Its body was shaped very much like a human's, somewhere between 4 and 5 foot tall and grey in colour. Its talons, described as being pincer-like with only 2 toes, were firmly wrapped around the branch on which it sat. And when it became aware of the couple looking up at it, it spread out its wings and looked down at them with glowing red eyes, a large gaping mouth in its otherwise flat face. And then, as seems to be a trademark of the Owlman by this point, the creature took off into the air, flying off into the dark of night, with the couple fleeing to safety as soon as it was out of sight. Honestly, given that every sighting involves the Owlman flying away as soon as he's seen, I find myself wondering if maybe the poor thing just doesn't like being stared at like he's a freak. Or maybe he's just shy, I don't know. Once again, after this sighting, the Owlman seemed to more or less disappear for several years. Maybe every time he gets seen, he just gets better at hiding. I'm really starting to think this guy's the real victim here. It's not like he's ever seeking people out or trying to scare them. He just wants to live his monstrous owl life in peace. It wasn't until the summer of 1995 when another sighting was reported, this time coming in the form of a letter written to local paper The Western Morning News. First-person accounts of the Owlman are pretty hard to find, so as I came across the contents of the letter online, I'm just going to read it verbatim, because this is one of only 2 sightings that I could find in the direct words of the person who experienced it. So, Dear Sir, I am a student of marine biology at the Field Museum Chicago on the last day of a summer vacation in England. Last Sunday evening I had a most unique and frightening experience in the wooded area near the old church at Mournen, Cornwall. I experienced what I can only describe as a vision from hell. The time was about 15 minutes after 9, more or less, and I was walking along a narrow track through the trees. I halted in my tracks when about 30 metres ahead I saw a monstrous birdman thing. It was the size of a man with a ghastly face, a wide mouth, glowing eyes and pointed ears. It had huge clawed wings and was covered in feathers of silver-grey colour. The thing had long bird legs which terminated in large black claws. It saw me and rose, floating towards me. I just screamed and then turned and ran for my life. The whole experience was totally irrational and dreamlike. Friends tell me that there is a tradition of a phantom Owlman in that district. Now I know why. I have seen the phantom myself. Please don't publish my real name and address. This could adversely affect my career. Now I have to rethink my worldview entirely. Yours very sincerely, Scared Eyewitness. I find it interesting how consistent reports of the Owlman are compared to other cryptids. His appearance and behaviour don't really seem to vary from sighting to sighting. Between 4 and 5 foot tall, covered in grey feathers, glowing red eyes and a gaping mouth, pointed ears, wings instead of arms, giant pincher feet. And the sightings are also incredibly localised to Mournen Church and the surrounding woods. And every single time he's seen, he does the same thing. He's just minding his own business, someone sees him and freaks out, and he flies off. His appearance scares people, sure, but he never does anything to frighten or hurt anyone, and he never seems to seek people out. The 1995 sighting by the American student is probably the last high-profile sighting of the Owlman, but not the final one. There continued to be occasional ones here and there, but as far as I can tell, there's only one from the 21st century, that of a 12-year-old girl who apparently saw him in September 2009. But for the most part, things have been very quiet on the Owlman front for the last 2 or 3 decades. Perhaps he's finally mastered the art of staying out of people's way. I mean, he certainly seems to want to. Or maybe he realised that it was kind of creepy that he was only ever seen by girls and young women and decided to, stop doing that. Another sighting was reported in 2019, but while it was new in the sense that it hadn't been made public before, it wasn't new in terms of the time frame. It actually took place in May 1978, so early on in the Owlman mythos. 2 girls were walking home one evening, and as they did so, they went along the road that goes past the church, when one of them suddenly cried out that she'd seen a man with wings, pointing towards the church they'd just passed. They both saw the Owlman and then dove into a hedge to try and hide as he hovered in the air silently watching them, before he eventually flew into the forest. This is another story where I was able to find a direct quote from a witness. It seemed about 4 feet long and had a pointy beak and huge eyes. They weren't red or anything, but they were looking at us. Here's the thing though, it had human features, such as a mouth and lips, but with a beak where the nose would be. The wings were the scariest part. They were almost like a huge feathery cloak, which seemed to move together as it flapped. They hardly seemed to separate like a bird's wings do. Even to this day, I've never seen anything so bizarre as that. This story was recounted in Britain's Paranormal Forests, Encounters in the Woods, a book by psychologist turned paranormal investigator Dr. Peter McHugh. It was told to him by a woman who runs a paranormal investigation group, which one of these girls would later join as an adult, and she maintains to this day that whatever she saw, it definitely wasn't an owl. But, like I said, the Cornish Owlman has been AWOL for a while, with no notable sightings for decades. And unlike many better-known cryptids, there isn't a single purported photo of him, not even a grainy low-resolution one. All we have to go on are descriptions and sketches from eyewitnesses. So, now we've gone over as many Owlman sightings as we can, let's shift our attention a little and ask, what actually is the Mournin' Owlman? Well, as you can imagine, there are plenty of theories, and they fall into 2 camps. There are theories from believers in the paranormal who think that the Owlman was actually a real thing, and there are theories from skeptics who might believe that people really saw something, but that it wasn't a real-life monster. Let's start with the paranormal ones because, well, they're just more fun. Of course, these can be very straightforward. That the Owlman is simply a cryptid or spirit of some kind that is either very good at hiding from people, or if he's more spectral in nature, can completely disappear. But that still doesn't answer the question of why? Why a human-bird hybrid? Why mourn in church? Well, there are all kinds of theories around that. Some people think that the church might be located on a particularly powerful ley line, and that the Owlman is a physical manifestation of that spiritual energy. Others think that he might have somehow been created or invoked by occultists, or that he could somehow be the embodiment of some ancient pagan deity, or even some kind of demon, although I can't understand the assumption that there's anything dark or demonic about the Owlman. Yeah, people were scared by him, but he never seemed to frighten them intentionally, and he certainly never chased or hurt anyone. And I don't know, I just feel like a demon or something would be a little more aggressive? And then, of course, there are the theories that the Owlman is actually an alien, or something to do with UFOs. I even saw it theorised that the people who thought they saw the Owlman were actually abducted by aliens, and they just don't remember any other part of the abduction, or it's a weird memory thing that the aliens did to them. I don't know. And then there's my favourite theory of all, and that's that the Owlman is somehow related to Mothman. Now, we all know who Mothman is, right? The creepy man-bird moth thing seen multiple times in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the US in the 1960s, who more recently has become a pop culture icon and beloved meme figure. Of course you know him, who doesn't? There are certainly lots of similarities between Mothman and Owlman. For a start, they were both said to be similar in size and stature to a human man, but dark-coloured with massive wings and glowing red eyes. Both are seen as being maybe cryptids, maybe spiritual, maybe UFO related. Both seem to be relatively benevolent and frighten people but never harm them. And both were first seen within a decade of each other, but have rarely been spotted within recent years. And both have always been very localised in where they've been spotted. One of the main differences seems to be that Mothman is usually portrayed as having arms as well as wings, whereas Owlman only has wings, although some descriptions of him include him having some kind of finger or talon-like protrusions coming from his wings, a bit like hands. Artistic impressions of the creatures tend to have a lot of overlap. So all of these similarities have led to theories amongst paranormal enthusiasts that Owlman and Mothman belong to the same species, or separate species but ones that are closely related in the same genus. Maybe they're transatlantic cousins or something. Or maybe they're boyfriends. This is my favourite theory, not because I think it's the most believable, but because I freaking love Mothman, and personally I would love to see Owlman get the same kind of attention and recognition. Like, Point Pleasant has an annual Mothman festival, and plenty of tourists visiting just for the city's Mothman connections. I'd love to see a similar thing happen to Owlman. He deserves more attention. It's not fair that his cousin hogs so much of the limelight. I wish this podcast had enough of a listener base that we could just, get together to put on an Owlman festival or something. But leaving the paranormal theories aside for a second, let's round out this episode by looking at some of the more realistic theories. One of the most popular explanations for Owlman's identity is that, well, he is just an owl, no man involved. Except, owls are kind of small, and Owlman was generally described as being between 4 and 5 foot tall, and none of our native British owl species seem to really resemble the Owlman. There are only 4 species of owl that would be considered common here in the UK: barney owls, torn owls, little owls, and short-eared owls. And certainly I don't think any of those could be mistaken for being a monstrous human-bird hybrid. However, there are other species that are much less common. Some because they only live in a very small area of the country, and others because they don't really tend to live here at all, but occasionally fly in as migrants. One species commonly put forward for this is the Eurasian eagle owl. Although these are native across much of Europe, they aren't traditionally found in the UK. However, it's not all that uncommon for reported sightings of them from birds that have either escaped captivity or flown over from the European mainland. There have even been confirmed cases of eagle owls settling here in the UK and breeding, albeit only recently and in very small numbers. Sightings of eagle owls are much more common up north, but there have been some confirmed sightings in southwest England over the years. So it's entirely possible that in the 70s, an eagle owl found itself in the woods near Mornan. People had just never seen or possibly even heard of an owl that size before. Especially if you're seeing it in the dark, you might be able to mistake it for some kind of monster. They're certainly more tawny coloured than grey, but their coloration does vary, and especially in poor lighting, you could easily mistake them as being less saturated. They have those pointy ear-like feathers that some owl species have, which also tally with descriptions of the owlman, and massive orange eyes that could easily be mistaken as being red. The one thing that doesn't work in the eagle owl's favour, though, is their size. I mean, they're big, as you'd expect from something named after an eagle, but not as big as a person in the way the owlman was often described. It's not unheard of for females of the species to reach 2.5 foot tall in height, which doesn't sound that impressive, and it doesn't always look that big in pictures either. But this is actually somewhere that I can chime in with a bit of my own experience, because when I was about 7 or 8, some people from a local falconry centre visited my school with a variety of different owls, and one of these was a Eurasian eagle owl. As we were walking into the hall, the eagle owl was perched on a piece of apparatus next to us, and as we walked past, we were whispering to each other about whether or not it was a real owl, because it was so massive that it seemed impossible. We were all pretty convinced that it must be a toy or a model or something. And then it turned its head to look at us, and the 3 or 4 of us closest to it, myself included, physically jumped back in shock. So yeah, I can attest to the fact that these owls definitely look a lot bigger in person, especially when you don't know what they are, or you're a child, or, as in this case, both. Like, if we'd come across it in the forest at night, yeah, there's a good chance we'd be just as terrified as most of the people who encountered the owlman were. And it's entirely possible that if the cause of the Owlman sightings really was an eagle owl, then it could just have been a particularly big individual. It can happen, sometimes an animal will just exceed the average of their species. Like, maybe this was an eagle owl who was closer to 3 or even 4 foot in height. Eagle owls also have a dramatically wide wingspan, which would probably also make them appear larger. But the Eurasian eagle owl isn't the only species put forward as a potential candidate for the owlman's true identity. Another possibility is that it could have been a great grey owl. These are definitely not a species that's ever going to come to the UK on their own. However, they're pretty common in captivity, be that in a zoo, private collection, or as a falconer's bird. So it's entirely possible that one escaped. These owls are even taller than the Eurasian eagle owl. Not by much, they're both just about as big as an owl can get. But even so, it would make it more likely that it could be mistaken for the kind of sizes the owlman was reported as being. And they're also grey, just like the owlman was. Great grey owls have yellow eyes rather than orange or red, but I do think their faces are interesting. They're flat, and with the colouring and the way that the feathers lie, it could easily make it look like they have a large gaping mouth rather than a beak. And of course they also have a very wide wingspan, up to 5 foot or more. Plus, the fact that they don't look like any of our native species of owl could also add to the otherworldly factor, or just them not being recognised as an owl. Unless you were super into birds, you probably wouldn't recognise it for what it was. And even aside from specific species, owls have always had a bit of a spooky reputation. In the Middle Ages, they were associated with witches, and considered to be bad luck or even as a warning sign of impending death. And their haunting cries and silent flight also led to them being associated with, and even mistaken for, ghosts. Often when something is deeply ingrained into our cultural psyche, we can end up adopting those beliefs without even becoming aware of it. Could it be that 1,000 years of superstition have left us with a subconscious belief that owls are inherently sinister and spooky? Would the Owlman story have spread so much if he looked more like, for example, a giant pigeon? And of course, if we're talking skeptical theories, we have to discuss the idea that this is all fake. Now, there are enough sightings of the Owlman that I do believe at least a couple of people did genuinely have experiences that scared them. However, that doesn't mean that every single person claiming to see the Owlman definitely did. Like that American tourist, for example. It would be so easy for someone to just write a letter lying about who they were and telling a made-up story about meeting a big scary owlman. And one thing that you may have already taken note of is the fact that the first reports of the Owlman both came via Doc Shields. And, like I said earlier, the guy had a bit of a reputation. It's entirely possible that the things he told the Fortean Times about the first 2 encounters were entirely fabricated. After all, neither of the Mellings girls or the 2 girls who were camping have ever come forward themselves. Sure, he could have used false names for them, in fact I really hope he did, but they could still have found a way to prove who they were. And maybe they just didn't want the drama, knowing that a lot of people would think they were mad. But the whole thing with raising sea monsters was clearly fake. The photos are obviously not real, and when Shields was first sending them to newspapers, he did so under a fake identity. Could this be the same kind of thing? Making up characters and saying that they'd had these paranormal experiences? I mean, what are the chances that both Don Mellings and Barbara and Sally both just happened to run into him and tell him about what they'd seen, but apparently not tell anyone else? And then, once word of the Owlman got out, people became predisposed to assume that any big creepy owl they saw half obscured by the darkness must be the monster they'd read about. Human memory is not a perfect recollection of events. Small details can easily shift and change over time, especially if it makes it more easily fit into a narrative or ideal that we have. So a large grey owl could easily become a massive human-sized owlman, and that memory would still seem to you to be as real as when you experienced it. And here's one more thing about Doc Shields. He knew he was full of BS. In an interview with Rupert White, he openly refers to himself as a charlatan, a mountebank, and a cheat. He ended his interview with the words, "You mustn't believe a word I say." His Wikipedia page literally lists hoaxer as one of his occupations. And yet he'd still claim that some of the stuff, like the sea monsters and the Owlman, were real. He was clearly someone who loved messing with people, deliberately leaving them unsure of what to believe and what was real. He was an artist and a performer, and that was part of his act. He wanted to leave people questioning reality and questioning him. He was absolutely someone who would create fake monsters just to see who he could get to believe him, and how many people would claim to have seen the thing he made up. Sadly, Doc Shields passed away in July this year at the age of 86, so if the Owlman was a fabrication of his, then we'll never know now. If you want my opinion, I think that the initial stories Doc came forward with were made up by him, and that later sightings were influenced by that. And I think that some of the other sightings may well have been hoaxes too, like the letter from the American tourist. As much as I love the paranormal, all things cryptid and ghost and alien, I don't actually believe in any of it. I'm a skeptic, a reluctant one, I'll admit. I'd love to genuinely believe in that kind of thing, but without solid evidence, I just can't make myself. But I do believe that people have experiences that they can't explain. Experiences that feel paranormal and can leave people shaken to the core. I mean, hell, even I've had a couple of experiences like that. But I just believe that most of those things deep down have some kind of rational explanation. And while I am a skeptic, I'm still open-minded. I'm definitely not the kind of person who thinks belief in the paranormal is stupid, and I do think there's much more to the world than we as humans currently understand. All this to say, I do think some people who reported Owlman sightings really did have experiences with something scary in the woods or near the church. I just don't think that it was a spirit or a cryptid. I think the popularity of Doc's stories left people predisposed to believe in the Owlman, or at least to be more open to the idea, so that when they then saw something they couldn't identify, they automatically made the leap. And I think an escaped or lost eagle owl or great grey owl could explain those sightings, especially given how they often seem to come in spades years apart. Maybe Doc saw one of these owls and was inspired to create a story from there, or maybe he heard someone talking about this big weird owl they'd seen. Going back to Mothman briefly, some people have also suggested that he could have, intentionally or not, inspired the Owlman. Mothman was first sighted about a decade before the Owlman, and he got a lot of media attention. In 1975, American journalist and paranormal enthusiast John Keel published a book called The Mothman Prophecies, in which he details his investigation into Mothman and his own alleged experiences with the creature, as well as his theories around the whole thing. This book went a long way in popularising Mothman, and it was published only the year before the first alleged Owlman sightings. Of course, it could just be a coincidence, but I think it's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that someone heard about the Mothman and was inspired to create something similar. Or even if the Mothman didn't directly inspire the Owlman as a whole, I think it's very possible that it could have inspired some people to report fake sightings or stage hoaxes in some other way. Given the kind of things that we know Doc Shields was into, I think he definitely would have been interested in a book like The Mothman Prophecies. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. What do you think? Do you believe the Owlman was paranormal in nature, or do you think it was all a hoax? Or do you have another theory that I haven't mentioned? Whatever your opinions, feel free to share them. I'd love to hear what other people think about this, especially if you're listening via YouTube and decide to share those opinions in the comments, because that really helps feed the algorithm and get this podcast out to more people. Hint, hint. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. I know this episode was a lot different from our normal content, but that will resume next week. I just couldn't let Halloween pass by without doing something to celebrate. And the Cornish Owlman seemed like the obvious choice to me because, like I said at the beginning of this episode, when I first read about him when I was a kid, I was absolutely freaked out by it. I don't even know why, because revisiting it now as an adult, there's nothing really scary about it. I don't know, maybe I just had some kind of deep-seated fear of giant owls when I was younger because of the eagle owl incident. We do have another Halloween special coming out before the spooky season is over. That's going to be a bonus mini-sode coming out on the 31st, Halloween itself. And it's going to be about a real-life animal that is just absolutely horrifying. Definitely scarier than this episode. If you listened to the entirety of last week's episode, you'll know that I ended that by complaining about the fact that I was ill, and I still am. And once again, I really hope you couldn't hear that too much in my voice. I've been ill for a full month now with whatever bug this is, and I don't know what to do to make it go away. So yeah, I'm sorry if you could hear how sore my throat is and stuff in this. I'm doing my best. And before I go, please let me know if you enjoyed this episode. I've been toying with the idea for a while of making a podcast about all things weird and paranormal and unexplained, but I don't really have that much spare time, so if I'm going to do it, then I kind of need to know that there's at least some people out there who are interested. It would kind of be similar in structure to this, but talking about things like the Owlman every week rather than real life animals. And obviously I'd still be doing and prioritising this podcast because I'd do it on behalf of an animal sanctuary to raise money for them, whereas the paranormally one would be my own personal project. But yeah, let me know if you'd be interested, and maybe I'll get around to actually doing that. Regardless, I'll still be here every single Tuesday bringing you a real-life animal story, and the Animal Nerd podcast will continue to donate 100% of any money made through the show to the Little Rescue Zoo, the animal sanctuary I'm involved with. So if you love animals, be sure to subscribe and support the show in any way that you can, because all of those things directly support their rescue work, which has fully saved animals' lives in the past. For sources, contact info, and our socials, please check out the show notes. And I think that's everything I need to mention, so thank you again for listening and putting up with my horrible ill voice. Hopefully I'll be better by next week. And I will see you next time. Stay wild, friends!